Whoever said hindsight is 2020 obviously never meant me. In the context of memories specifically, memories can be of incorrect details. Memories can also be of incorrect interpretations. Adjacently and unrelated to hindsight, even if there are correct details and correct interpretations, people have an increasing probability or opportunity of change as the time between an event and the examination of said event increases. As such, I don't generally hold people to things I think they did or didn't say or do in the past, and I see it as important to acknowledge fallibility and keep a probabilistic view. So, let's examine it step by step through the mystical art of words on a screen with narration. There's a person. They have a conversation with another person. A says the word. A says the words. I hate cheeseburger. Scenario 0. Nobody remembers, but that's not contextually relevant, so we're going to ignore that and all other contextually just irrelevant scenarios. Alright, relevant scenario 1. Years later, B remembers and recites similar words. He says, "Hey, remember when you said I can has cheeseburger?" But person A didn't say that. They disagree. So there's a miscommunication and Big Tony dies and there's no cake. Relevant scenario 2. Years later, B remembers and recites misinterpretation of those words. "Hey, didn't you say that you hate our mutual friend named Cheeseburger?" Person A also disagrees and Big Tony dies and there's still no cake. And of course there are other scenarios where we disconnect over an expression or interpretation. There is an opposite case, and there's a bunch we haven't covered, but again, they're not in line with what I'm trying to communicate. So, in addition to those scenarios, we can apply assertion of memory versus fallibility of memory. That is to say, if someone can accept that they may be wrong on one or more relevant axes. So, let's return to the scenario with B remembering an inaccurate interpretation. Years later, B remembers and recites his interpretation of those words. "Hey, didn't you say you hate our mutual friend named Cheeseburger?" Person A disagrees. There's a miscommunication. The disconnect exists, Slipknot reference. So to look at the fork going from there. If person B asserts their recollection, they may think that person A is wrong, or they might even accuse person A of lying, and there are many reasons where that might be the case. So it could be that person B has a specific perception of person A, so they think it's super unlikely and just unwilling to accept it. Or it could be that they think person A is a genuine liar, and they're like, "Oh, you're a habitual liar. Why would I trust you on this?" Da, da, da. Or it could be the severity of the impact of that misinterpretation of the expression. Or it could be that person B is working on a history of self-doubt with relation to these things, maybe because traumatic, history of being gaslit or something like that. There could be a lot of reasons, hearsay or whatever have you. But regardless of the specific reason, there is still an unresolved disconnect or miscommunication. From my perspective, the goal of communication is communication, or to not have unresolved disconnects and miscommunication. Ultimately, it is to express things and have it be interpreted that way. The goal is generally connection from it. So, the other side of the fork is if person B is willing to accept that their memory or interpretation is fallible. In practice, it might look like person A disagrees, and then person B acknowledges that they might be remembering wrong, and then A and B could just move on. They can accept the prior miscommunication, or they could investigate it further and try to find the source. But in either direction they choose in that additional fork, there is a connection. It's also important to note that person A could also have just as easy... It's also important to note that person A could also just as easily disagree but acknowledge fallibility. It just so happens in these specific hypothetical scenarios, it's baked into the premise that it's person B that misinterpreted or that they are misremembering specific details or whatever have you. But if you get rid of that presumption, which we're including for the sake of simplicity, and now I'm telling you to remove it for the sake of this point, it is possible that the disconnect comes from person A expressing something that we would consider the interpretation of person B as being the most reasonably correct interpretation. all of that is to say, person A can express things poorly. Anyways, yet another important note is that in communication and outside this video, like I'd say basically in all regards, blame isn't such a useful concept, and it can generally be really detrimental to connection and communication. Which is extra ironic considering I just blame person A, but that's not the point. Back to me, the star of the show, not a participant because these are hypotheticals that are not based. Okay. One sec. Focusing on me again. Those are hypothetical scenarios that are not real scenarios as far as I'm aware. So now we're bringing it out of the scenarios and onto me specifically. So, in addition to accepting fallibility, the next step in the direction of my personal growth that I've been on was opposed to just allowing myself to be wrong, to actively seek out being wrong, to create and look at opportunities for my wrongness. This looks like when I talk to people, particularly if it is something nuanced and I give like a 4 to 5 minute monologue, to ask them to rephrase it to me, to clarify that there is understanding, that there is connection, and that I did not express things poorly or was not misinterpreted in some way. This isn't something that everyone gets to see of me. It tends to extremely heavily skew towards like newer additions to my life. And I've talked about my struggles with not feeling understood and with not understanding efforts towards being understood or other people understanding me, and how it's mostly determined based on like my feeling of impact rather than on like my rational considerations of, hey, that's a homie. I've known, homie for whatever amount of time or whatever. So they probably want to understand and be understood as well, and it's probably putting in effort, and I just can't see it because we didn't have the tools when we originally started communicating that would have been helpful to reach this end. So the pattern of not reaching communication and connection was probably rigged from the start, so to speak. So the most current and ongoing step for my entire life has been to apply all of these principles and other principles to people which I don't interpret as having the basis of knowledge or not having the willingness to obtain said knowledge. It is an important node for me to grow into because my ideal self is to exist as myself without regard to the external. And if I am continually shifting the depth of which I allow myself to exist based on the audience, I'm sort of working against that, and not 100%. So there is a critical blind spot there, but I haven't resolved it yet, and you're going to have to wait for a future video on that one. Sorry, love you, bye!